So I want to compare a little bit about China's bailout to the U.S. because after the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. bailout, I mean, there was some of it which was direct checks to citizens, but that was a very small amount. Most of the money was through quantitative easing, which is essentially the Fed issuing additional currency that then ended up really boosting stock prices. And so the stocks went up, but sort of artificially, right? So the price to value ratio went up. And we didn't really see a lot of consumer inflation, but we saw inflation in assets. And those assets included a lot of luxury goods, fine art, and so on. But real estate was one of the big, I don't know if I want to say winners, but it was one of the things that went up, right? Because when people of a certain class, that is the investor class, has this additional money, because that's ultimately how the stimulus worked, that money goes into real estate, not consumer spending. And so that was the U.S. bailout. You're saying China's bailout was 10 times greater. Was it done in a similar way? Or was, what is it about that bailout that led to these massive increases in real estate prices?
Sure. So basically what China did at the time is basically the baseline stimulus number was, I forget the exact number, maybe it was about a couple $100 billion US dollars, maybe 3, 4, maybe even 500 billion. I forget the exact number. But what they did is they crafted it so that local governments got that money. They had projects that they were going to work on, and they actually were told, go to the banks, use the money we're giving you as basically the equity portion, borrow from the banks to then go out and build roads, bridges, apartment buildings, things of that nature. So the overall package was 3 to 4 times, once you counted the bank money, that these local governments added to the equity portion that they got from the government.
Okay, so that's essentially why there's also a massive increase in debt.
Yes, absolutely. Because what happened was, I forget who said it, but was this linked to CCP policies? And yes, it was. The seeds were absolutely directly sown from these CCP policies, because now you had local governments that were dependent upon this money. They were dependent upon the banks to fund these projects. You had the construction companies that were absolutely dependent upon this revenue, that employed enormous numbers of people, and they had to hit, the local governments had to hit their GDP targets. So they started hitting their GDP targets. Growth took off. And so every time in subsequent times that growth started to decline a little bit, the central government would say, hey guys, we're close to not hitting our targets. Go out, borrow money, build more bridges, build more apartment buildings, things like that. And so it was basically this vicious cycle that, they wanted to hit their targets, go out, borrow more, build something, even if nobody's going to use it, go out, borrow more, so that we can hit our targets. And it became this very vicious cycle.
And I think what's interesting about that is over these past, basically since the 2008 financial crisis, you had a lot of influential business leaders, like I'm thinking Michael Bloomberg, to an extent Elon Musk, pointing to China and saying, hey, look, they can build bridges. They can do all these things that we can't do. We should take China as a model. And you're saying it was not a good thing.
So I think specifically on what they were doing, the entire infrastructure model in China was build it in anticipation of growth. Okay, so that if we have a couple of years where people aren't going to be using it heavily, then that's okay, because growth is going to catch up, and in a couple of years there's going to be growth to support that. But what's happened is, and the stories are just legendary. Some of these things. Of just every town, has a massive, has a massive airport. Okay. Well, you know what? Not every town needs a massive international airport. The amount of high-speed rail that got built, and in places that really couldn't support it. And if you recognize that that's going to have to be an ongoing tax expenditure to support a project, then that's okay. We do that here in the United States. They do that at times in China. But if you're going to say, hey, here's a bridge, a road, whatever it is, that has to pay for itself in some way. Maybe it's fees, and then maybe it's also subsidies from the government budget. But China didn't account for ongoing subsidies that they would have to pay for a lot of this infrastructure that was built.
Well, I think also another side of this is the propaganda side of this. Because imagine if you're like a Chinese person who has survived probably barely, like the Great Famine or the Cultural Revolution. You've seen China with nothing, no food even, and now suddenly everything's being built up. Oh, my little town has an airport. The party is doing great.
That's absolutely correct. There is absolutely an enormous pride in this, and one of my most enduring memories just of China is the number of times I would see elderly, and one of the book projects, to be honest, I wanted to do at some point, which I never got to do, was and it was inspired by my own grandmother, or my mom, interviewing her grandmother, who lived from roughly 1880 to 1980. And in her life, she traveled across the Midwest in a covered wagon, and she flew on a 747 later in life. And I would see some of these elderly in China, and I would be like, I can't even imagine what they have lived through in, growing up, being born in 1930, 40, something like that in China, and later in life, seeing what China's become. So there's absolutely an enormous amount of pride in that. It's also created significant economic and financial stresses, which is what we're seeing now.
So we talked about real estate being part of this problem. What other things are contributing to the overall kind of bleak economic picture that you're saying China's facing now?
So I think basically the overall model is, and this is one of the reasons why we describe it as kind of like an event horizon. The overall model is basically reaching its ultimate endpoint, where you have to make significant changes, and the stresses are so great, it's just a question of which bad choice do you want. And what I mean by that is, as an approximate number, about 30% of the Chinese economy is related to real estate. And when we say 30%, we're talking, people buying appliances, steel that goes into rebar, or, stainless steel refrigerators, all the accompanying things that go with it. Well, if you take real estate and infrastructure, China's real estate market at this point is significantly overbuilt. Okay, there's a lot of apartments that will probably never be lived in the tens of millions range, and that has enormous amounts of financial pressures and things like that. So when we talk about these pressures, the question becomes, let's take a simple scenario. Out of the Chinese economy, you take 30% of that economy away, the real estate. Let's assume that no more apartments are going to get built in China starting today. Okay. Where does that growth come from? Okay. I mean, where does that growth come from? Well, you could export, but China is now such a big number. For China to export its way out of these problems would literally require such imbalances in the global economy. I mean, there's imbalances now because of how much China exports. But if you say China's going to export its way out of these problems, you're talking just such imbalances on a scale that the world truly has never seen. And so think about it this way: the example I would use is, if you look at an economy in a simple way, there's three basic inputs, kind of like you're going to make brownies or a cake or something like that. There's three basic inputs into an economy: the number of people. Okay, so if you have more people, think of it like truck drivers. The more truck drivers you have, the more trucks you can drive and the more stuff you can move. Okay, same thing for an economy at large. Okay, so for many years, China's economy was benefiting from adding more workers to the workforce. Okay, well, now China, the number of workers in China is actually declining. And in fact, it's been declining since about, I think, 2014 or so. So it's harder to grow your economy if you have fewer people in that